Hi there, this is Maria Williams. Today I'm featuring 3 cards that I made with the stitched blooms, stamps, and dies from Concord and Ninth. Here's a quick look at the products. I did already take the dies apart. They do come all attached together. And the largest die in the set just pierces little dots into the paper. And you have a couple different sentiments, thank you and love, as well as dies for all the flowers and a square kind of fancy frame. And then the stamps, you have the thinking of you, love you, miss you, thank you, hello, as well as the stamps for the flowers. The first card I'm going to create is a top folding card, and the front panel is going to be white, but I'm going to add some pattern paper from the Stamp Market to the inside of the card, and you're going to be able to see the sides of it because my front panel is going to be a little bit narrower. This panel is part of my silhouette cut file that I will have a link to on my blog post. You'll be able to download it there. And it's not a substitute for anything that Concord and Ninth offers. It is just a way to easily cut around the pattern that the die leaves on the cardstock. If you don't want to use your silhouette machine, you can definitely fussy cut it by hand, but I am not a huge fan of fussy cutting, so this was my alternative. I'm going to impress this pattern 3 times onto my cardstock panel, and I'm using my Gemini today. I did try it with my Big Shot, which is pretty old and my plates are old, and I did not get that great an impression. And I didn't realize until later that it was making such a huge difference. So make sure that you've got plenty of pressure on your die cutting machine when you run this through. Here's a quick look at what it looks like on the back, and the die really does get pretty stuck in there, so you have to be careful that you don't tear your cardstock or warp it too much. So you do have to be kind of careful when you pull it out. For some reason, I used 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock for this panel, and I really should have used 110-pound. This would have given my card a little bit more stability and would have eliminated the little bit of warping that you will see later. I'm going to run the panel through my die cutting machine 2 more times. So I have marked the center of the panel so that I can place the die on 1/2 and kind of get a pretty symmetrical look. So just like I did before, I am taping the die down onto my cutting plate so that it doesn't move. And again, I'm using my Gemini machine. Even though I want the pattern to be pretty symmetrical, I'm not being super careful about it and doing a whole lot of measuring. I'm just kind of eyeballing that the two impressions ended up in about the same place. And as you can see, after I've run it through my die cutting machine 3 times, there is a little bit of warping because of all the pressure on the piece of cardstock. But I think it's okay the way it is. I really didn't want to recut my panel with the silhouette and everything, so I just kept on going. Next, I need to create a flap on the front of the card so that I can glue it onto the back of the card. So I just lined up the front and the back panels, and I'm putting them on my scoring board and using the back panel as my guide to score the line. It ends up being about 1/4 of an inch. I fold very carefully along that scored line, and then I'm going to use some pretty thin double-sided adhesive to glue this onto the inside of the back panel. I thought that I could maybe use the 1/4 inch tape, but it ended up being just a little bit too wide, and I didn't want to risk anything gluing where it didn't need it, where it shouldn't get glued together. So I'm just using a skinnier tape. This one is about 1/8 of an inch. To cover up that flap, I'm just going to use the pattern paper. So I'm using a little bit of Nuvo Deluxe adhesive and gluing that into place. And then later on, I will place a white panel on top of that to write my message. At this point, I was getting ready to stamp the flowers and cut out the sentiment, and I thought that I would show you the double-sided adhesive sheets that I use on my MISTI. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you've seen that I just use these sheets on my mini MISTI all the time, and I use them to death till they are so stained. They really last a long time. So it's just basically a grid sheet that is covered in removable adhesive and that has release paper on two sides. And the thing to look out for is the 1 inch where the numbering starts is different on the front and the back. So depending on how you cut the sheet, you may not end up with that 0 point on the grid. So I'm just using the this half. Actually, it's a little bit more than half of the sheet, but to cover my MISTI. So I'm basically lining it up to the bottom of that sheet, and as you can see, I end up with that 0 point on the grid in one of my corners. And then I just take a craft knife. I find this easier than using scissors, and I'm just going to run it along the edge of my MISTI pad. This cuts really easily through all the layers. All I had to do was one pass. I'm going to just fold my release paper back over the exposed area so that I can save that for another occasion. And then I just keep cutting all the way around my MISTI pad. When I'm done trimming all the sides, I just remove the second release paper, and my pad is ready to go in. And I did have an issue with the backing tearing, but it's really no big deal. You just take it off carefully. The adhesive sheet will kind of try to come off the MISTI pad in the beginning, but later on, the more you use it, actually, the less it seems to want to pull up from the MISTI pad. And I just want to reiterate that this is removable adhesive, obviously. And then the only other thing that I like to do to make sure that my pad stays in place is I take some removable adhesive tape runner. This is actually one that I bought for my nephew and he never got. But anyway, don't tell him. And then I just place my MISTI pad back in place. And this way, nothing moves. Okay, so back to the card now. I'm going to stamp and die cut all the images for my card, and since I'm going to be doing so many leaves and flowers, what I have done is set up all the stamps in my MISTI, and then I die cut them out once. So now I have my template set up. Again, because I've got that adhesive sheet, that's not going to move at all. So then I'm just running the flower and the leaf dies through my Gemini Junior multiple times. I actually, because I'm using 80-pound Neenah Solar White, I am running 2 sheets of cardstock through at the same time, and I have no problems whatsoever with them cutting. And then all I have to do is pop one of each one of the images into my MISTI and ink up the stamps and stamp. I'm going to be stamping everything twice, and I'm using inks from the Stamp Market. This pink is Fresh Pink, and the green that I'm using for the leaves is called Leafy, how appropriate. And then the fancy square is die cut out of Mossy cardstock. When I'm done stamping, I just use my paper piercer to very gently and carefully get under each one of the die cuts, and they just pop right out. I've gone ahead and attached the square to the card front with some double-sided adhesive foam tape, and then I'm going to work on the thank you. I'm using the 2 dies from the die set, and I'm just taping them centered onto a piece of, I think this was 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock. I ran them through my die cutting machine, and then to keep all the letters in place, I am using a piece of purple tape on the backs of the letters, and that way I can remove them all together. And if I decide to attach them to another card, or if I want to color them, it'll be easier to work with them this way. I did end up having to use something to push the letters out of their spaces, but I was able to get them all out together. Next, I'm going to take a circle die that's just a little bit larger than the sentiment, and I'm going to tape it in place and run this through my die cutting machine. I want some gold foil cardstock behind my sentiment, and in order to make it match perfectly, I could mark it and cut it out with scissors, but I thought I would just line up the letters, line up the die, and just run the strip of cardstock through my die cutting machine as well. Then all I have to do is put a little bit of glue in between the letters on my white circle and attach the 2 pieces together. I still need to attach the inside piece for the O and the tiny little piece for the A. So I did go ahead and glue in the inner part of the O, but the A is so very tiny that I just didn't think I would be able to do it. So I took a white gel pen and just kind of sort of drew the shape in there. And I don't think that you can tell that it's not a little tiny piece of cardstock. I glued down the circle to my card front with some liquid adhesive, and then I started to arrange the flowers and the leaves. And I realized that my full flowers didn't have any centers. They were just white centers. So I thought that the easiest thing to do at this point would be to grab my Wink of Stella gold marker. This is not a brush pen, this is a marker, and just fill in all the centers. This didn't just fill in the spaces, but it also added a little bit of glitter, which I think made the flowers look extra pretty. This marker dries really fast, so I was able to color the centers in and then immediately get back to attaching the flowers to the card. I attached some of them with some of that foam adhesive, and some of them I just attached flat onto the card. And kind of the same thing with the leaves, depending on where they were. In some areas I had to put double-sided adhesive so that they would be at the same height as that mossy square that I had die cut. I have sped this part of the video way up because there's nothing special about the way that I'm attaching the flowers, just kind of whatever looked good to me. For the inside of the card, I cut out a panel of white cardstock that was just a little bit smaller than the front panel. I didn't want this to show at all when the card was closed, so I just added a flower and a couple of leaves that are exactly the same as the ones on the front, and then just glued the panel to the inside of the card. Last but not least, I added some jewels from Pretty Pink Posh's Valentine Jewels Mix. I love how pretty this card turned out with the little touch of gold and the jewels. So here's another quick look at the finished card. My second card is totally completely different and really easy to make. It's a holiday card, and you could skip this whole step of stamping the card base if you just wanted to use some pattern paper on the front of your card. But I have taken a 110-pound Nina Solar white card base and temporarily adhered it to the inside of my MISTI. This is my regular size MISTI, and because I'm using a red rubber stamp, I have taken out my pad. Originally, I was going to use Cherry Kisses ink from the Stamp Market as well as the cardstock, but I couldn't get the image to stamp fully. So then I took my Distress Oxide ink and tried that, and it still wasn't stamping all the way. And I will show you how I fixed the edge later on in the video. I removed my striped rubber stamp from my MISTI and replaced the pad. And then I'm taking a piece of Cherry Kisses cardstock from the Stamp Market, prepping it with some anti-static powder, and stamping the image with Versamark ink. This stamp is from the Stampin' Village's Holiday Seals that came out last year. I'm next taking my white Stampendous embossing powder and sprinkling it over my image, and then I will heat set it with my heat gun. My heat gun is super old that I bought at Michael's years and years and years ago, and I've been debating whether to get the Hero Arts embossing tool or the WOW one. The WOW one has the 2 speeds, so I'm kind of leaning towards that one. To cut out this circular sentiment, I am using a circle punch. It's about 1 3/4 inches in diameter, but you could definitely use a die for this instead. I created a large gold cardstock panel. This is some matte gold cardstock from Tonic, and I just ran it through my die cutting machine with that die twice, with the largest portions closer to each other. And then I used a stitch rectangle die that measures about 4 1/8 inches by 3 7/8 inches to die cut it out. And I can use the other portion for a different project. Then to mount this rectangle onto my card base, I'm using some fun foam. I happen to have red in my stash, so I'm using that. I don't want it to get bent at all. It already got a little bit warped, so I want to make sure it stays as flat as possible. I don't know if this did much of anything, but I did run my bone folder over the back of my rectangle to get it as flat as possible, and then I just added some liquid glue, and I made sure that I added the glue in the areas where there weren't any holes because I didn't want the glue squishing out to the front of the panel. While that glue was drying, I went to work on fixing the white patches on my card base, and all I did was take a small brush and dip it into the ink pad and just brush the ink on. And as you can see, it covered really well and blended right in. I went ahead and dried the card base with my heat tool a little bit just to make sure that I didn't have any issues with smearing. And then all I had to do was put the three pieces together. So I attached the fun foam with some adhesive glue and put a block on there to make sure that it adhered really well, and then just use some foam tape to attach the circle to the center of the card. Whenever I get ready to use this card, I will probably add another sentiment to the center of the card and of course write a message, but for now I'm just leaving the inside of the card blank. The only other thing I added to this card was a dot that I had created with some Nuvo drops. I created a bunch of them on a silicone mat, so I'm just using one of those. And here is finished card number 2. My last card is going to be a gatefold card, and I have already tested the piercing die on some pattern paper. I just wanted to make sure that it was going to stand out enough, and I like the way it looks, but I'm going to be using black and white paper for the actual card. So to make my card base, I have a piece of cardstock that is cut to 4¼ inches by 11. And then basically what you're doing is the two front pieces are going to be a quarter of the length of the cardstock. So basically the card is going to end up being 5½ inches wide. So you divide the 5½ inches by 2 and you come up with 2¾ inches. So that's where I'm scoring on the two sides of the cardstock. And one thing that I should have done here that I didn't is I should have measured the cardstock to make sure that it was exactly 11 inches because I ended up having a little bit of a gap in the middle, but I decided to just go ahead and go with it. I just need to score my lines really well and my card base is ready. Next, I'm going to cut the pattern paper that's going to go on the front of the card. So I'm taking one piece of pattern paper and trimming it down to 4¼ inches tall. And of course, it needs to be over 5½ inches wide. And then I'm cutting one piece to one end to 2¾ and then the piece right next to it at 2¾ and so the main thing is to make sure that your two pieces of pattern paper are from the same piece and that the pattern flows. So then making sure that my pieces are on the correct side where they're going to be on the card, I'm going to take the die and tape it to one of the pieces of pattern paper and run it through my die cutting machine. I'm going to do the same with the second piece, making sure that I have the die oriented in the right direction. And I'm going to be very careful when I pull the die off of the paper, just like I did with the cardstock, because the die will really be stuck into the piece of paper. So there's a little bit of warping again, but that's okay. I'm going to use some strong adhesive to attach the two pieces to my card base. I could have used liquid glue, but again, I'd have to worry about the glue squishing through the little holes, so I decided to use some Tombow Extreme. I chose the Love You sentiment from the stamp set, so I just have a strip of Neenah Solar White cardstock, and I'm going to stamp the Love You with Tuxedo Memento Tuxedo black ink. And unfortunately, my camera cut out. I ran out of storage, and I'm missing the rest of the stamping. But I also stamped a couple of little red stamps from the set, little detail ones, and then I die cut the whole thing with the rectangle die. I wanted to show you how I stamp the centers of the flowers. So I already have my stamp set up in the MISTI, but then what you can do to make sure that you are stamping in the right place is to put a piece of acetate over your image and stamp on it, and if it looks right, which I actually got it smack dab in the middle, I was very impressed with myself, you can remove that and then go ahead and stamp. So you already saw me earlier stamping the pink flowers, so I didn't feel like I needed to repeat that, but this is how I did the centers. I just moved the template that I had before and place the stamp in the MISTI and then stamp the centers with black ink. Now when I stamped the centers, I didn't press down at all. I didn't want the stamp to smush and for the black to run into the red. So I just kind of let my MISTI door slam shut, and that was perfect. I'm now going to start assembling my card. So the main thing that I have to remember is that the banner, the sentiment strip, can be stuck to the left side of the card, but not to the right. I have to obviously be able to open the card. So I have to be mindful of where I stick my flowers and my leaves. So I started out by attaching one of the sort of, I'll call it a half flower, to the back of the sentiment strip, and then I will place the other one that's just like it on the other side of the card, but instead of attaching it to the sentiment strip, I will attach it to the card. And then I will attach some other elements that will go underneath that sentiment strip, and then some that will go on top of the sentiment strip, but that won't interfere with the opening of the card. Since I'm basically gluing some of the flowers flat onto the card, some of them onto the sentiment strip, and then putting some of the other ones on pieces of my foam squares, I've gone ahead and sped this up to about 500% so that you can kind of see how I went about putting everything on. I did try to keep it fairly symmetrical, so the flowers are symmetrically, is that right? Around the sentiment strip, but then the leaves, there's a little bit of variation in how the leaves are around the flowers. Just like I did for the first card, I also embellished the inside of the card with one of the flowers. In this case, I used one of the half flowers and this little green stem that also comes in the Stamp and Die set. And then to add a little bit more interest to the card, I grabbed my clear Wink of Stella brush and added a whole lot of it to the red areas of the flowers. I thought about adding some sequins or some Nuvo drops or something else to the card, but I really just liked it the way it was. I didn't want to deter any further from the design on the card base, so I just finished it like that. I'm going to give you one last look at the completed card, but then I also wanted to show you the cuts that you can make with the silhouette file that I will have linked on my blog post. So here are some of the pieces that you can cut with the cut file. These two you could use on opposite sides of a card, kind of like the gatefold card. So you could cut them out of different colors of cardstock than the base. Here's one that is the same shape as what I did for the Christmas card, and then this is the one that I used for the first card that I made. I actually have two other cuts, one that cuts all the way around the design and one that cuts the edge on both sides like the first card that I made. And finally, here are a couple more cards that I made. This one is a note card, so it's a little bit smaller than an A2 card. And I used the Little Love Tags dies to cut that tag and the tag topper. And here is another thank you card that I made with one of the cuts from the cut file and embossing the design twice with the same rectangular die that I used for my third card, and similar flowers. And so just another idea. And you can see that that one, the design isn't as impressed. I used my Big Shot for that one, so it's not as good. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please, please, please give me a thumbs up. And I love your comments. They just make my day. For links to the products I used, please check the video description. Thank you so much.